Hi, I'm Adam.
And I'm Jane.
And you're listening to the ITPro Podcast, where we are currently recovering from a long night spent in Twitter jail.
Twitter jail or Twitter quarantine?
Well, both. Pick your poison. We were, like all verified users, humble brag, we were unable to tweet for an extended period last night following a widespread hack of Twitter's systems.
Yes, now I must say that despite being a blue tick bearer myself, also humble brag, I missed this because I saw it start to happen and then the lockdown didn't. So all verified accounts were locked. The hackers apparently gained access to high-profile accounts by, well, depending on who you listen to, either bribing an insider or possibly some other kind of social engineering attack.
Whatever the method, internal Twitter tools were used to gain access to high-profile accounts such as Elon Musk, Barack Obama, and Bill Gates, who all tweeted identical cryptocurrency scams, promising that they would double any Bitcoin sent to a particular address for a period of 30 minutes in a supposed effort to give back.
Yes, I was going to say, did you see the messages? It's sort of like, I'm feeling super generous after COVID-19. Send your money here and I will double it. It's like kind of, it's very much the, hello, you don't know me, but your rich uncle who you didn't know you had has died. And all you need to do is transfer your money to this bank account and you can get £1 million
of
absolutely. Twitter.
It's phishing 101. It's really basic stuff. And the thing that jumped out to me was it's not even new. So if you've paid attention to the previous tweets of any of these individuals, if you look in the replies, a lot of the time there are dummy accounts which have the same display name, the same profile picture, but slightly different actual usernames. So the bit with the @ attached to it, made to look like these users who have been for a long time in the replies of, their supposed, their target's tweets, promising similar scams.
Yes, but, for this one, it's, the real deal, if you were. What really was those verified accounts tweeting as if they were those people. Do you think anybody fell for it?
Well, we know people fell for it because the nature of Bitcoin is that we can see the transactions being made on the blockchain. So the Bitcoin addresses that were published as part of this scam have so far received about $120,000 or so, I think. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Although
but that's actually not that much of a return, considering how high profile these tweets were and how many people would have seen it.
Yes, and I'm not up for right now doing some maths off the top of my head, but that could be actually sort of $20 or whatever with several people. You can get up to that, and given the followership of these particular accounts and the scope of Twitter, a small proportion of people who saw them needs to donate. Okay, I don't know if donate is quite the right word there.
Well, only if you donate to a mugger.
Yeah. But you only really need a small proportion of people to fall for it, and you've managed to rake in a tidy sum.
One thing that jumped out to me was this seems very unambitious for an attacker that has access to the accounts of so many hugely powerful and influential people. Why did they not go for something a bit more imaginative than a fairly boilerplate cryptocurrency scam? Although we were discussing off mic with our guest for this episode, teaser, that we don't actually know how much information they may have extracted from the direct messages of those users, which could potentially have given the hackers a lot of very interesting information.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to consider here. There's you say, why weren't they more ambitious? If your ambition is to just get some money out of people with quite low effort, then, kind of achievement unlocked. If your ambition is to do something else, then, like you say, possibly this was actually a smokescreen for them to do something different, which is what happens typically with DDoS and that kind of thing. You divert attention one way and then sneak in the back door. Of my house analogy.
We'll be exploring this topic in more detail later on in the show, where we'll be diving into the shadowy and secretive world of hacking, as seen through the eyes of a professional penetration tester who's paid to break into secure networks. Before that, though, let's talk about this week's other bombshell news.
Yes, so from a tech point of view, possibly the biggest story of the week, month, or even year is that the UK government has banned Huawei from its 5G networks, with operators being compelled to remove all the company's equipment by 2027.
That's right, we've got a detailed analysis piece up on the site about the specifics of the ban and the potential implications that it could have both for operators and for users. But in short, the ban has only affected the 5G networks. It doesn't compel operators to remove Huawei equipment from broadband networks, and it doesn't compel them to remove them from networks using 2G, 3G, and 4G technology.
Yeah, so on the broadband point, they won't have to rip and replace anything, and they can actually continue buying from Huawei for a little bit, although not indefinitely.
It's up to the end of December, right?
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, I think probably the reason for that is for the sake of whatever the motivation is here, and I'm sure that we can come on to that in just a second. Do you really want to cripple the country's IT infrastructure, especially given how dependent we are on it currently, but just in general.
And I think this is a really important point because various experts, both on the telco vendor side and independently, have said that removing Huawei's technology from the infrastructure and replacing it with something else will be hugely costly, but will also set back the development and spread of the UK's 5G network by months, if not years.
Yes, and actually you've raised something important there when it comes to the broadband issue again. It's seen widely that the reason for not replacing Huawei's kit and indeed allowing companies to continue purchasing it until the end of the year is to enable the government to meet its manifesto promise of gigabit internet across the country by 2025. You can't do that if you decide that you're just going to be like, well, I mean, we could do that, or we could just disconnect the whole internet and try again. So this is based largely on advice from the National Cybersecurity Centre, NCSC, but the advice from them has vacillated as well.
So a previous report in January ruled that Huawei's technology was not a risk to the UK's national security. What's changed in the meantime is that the US has enacted a trade embargo against Huawei. The range is slightly broader than that in terms of how it affects Huawei, its customers, and its suppliers. But the key point for this story and this particular development is that Huawei can't use any US technology in its chip design or manufacture, which means that a lot of the industry standard tools that chip makers and technology manufacturers in general use to construct and validate their chips is now closed to Huawei. And the act of replacing those process tools and those design tools, the NCSC fears, may introduce unreliability issues and security issues because they're having to essentially cobble together a replacement for an industry standard tool that has seen a lot of development and iteration.
I mean, I think that we have to address the elephant in the room here, which is that this is really, it's a political decision, not a technological one. It has massive tech impacts, obviously, but the decision is to a greater or lesser extent political. It's known that within the Conservative Party, there are voices who have been calling for the banning of Huawei and indeed who don't think that the 2027 deadline is soon enough. And, trade deals with the US are important, are probably going to get increasingly important, and we need to make sure that we're on side with them, or that will definitely be the thinking. And so I think that's, this is not a political podcast, but when it comes to Huawei in general, and when it comes to this story in particular, it's politically motivated tech story.
Yeah, and it's impossible to separate the technological side of Huawei's 5G business from its political implications. And it's interesting the point you raise about trade deals with the US, because China is not happy at all about this decision. The Chinese ambassador has tweeted that the UK essentially is becoming not a fair and open trade market in light of this decision. Many commentators have predicted that this could spark a trade war with China, where they enact, tougher import tariffs, where they stop buying from UK companies so much. And yeah, while the US is a hugely important market for UK companies and will continue to be so, particularly after Brexit, China is also a massive and growing tech market, and it may not be the best idea to alienate that market when tech investment and tech trade is becoming more and more important.
Yeah, it's a very knotty issue, and it always is when there are political factors at play, because when it comes to China, there are further political considerations as well. Bringing it back to kind of UK businesses here, we will indeed, by the time this podcast goes out, have a feature up on what it means for UK business and whether we can develop a rival ourselves or a replacement. But do you think that it could have a chilling effect on UK growth and innovation?
I think it's hard to predict the outcome. 5G is still a very nascent technology. I mean, the UK's 5G speeds, as we've covered previously on the podcast, are lagging some 3 times behind the US's. 5G is still far from nationwide in terms of its rollout and development. This will absolutely slow the spread of 5G, but with 5G still so early on in its development and implementation, it's very tough to say what that slowdown will mean for UK innovation. What I think is interesting is whether or not EU countries will follow suit in banning Huawei, because that's 2 of the major Western countries that have now banned Huawei from their infrastructures in its entirety. And if countries like France, Germany, Spain, Italy start doing the same, then that could spell big trouble for Huawei.
Yeah, it's worth noting Huawei is not the only game in town. Ericsson and Nokia are both European companies that play in the networking business. Nokia made its name, and as did Ericsson, in mobile networking. And they're not just handsets, they are a big deal when it comes to infrastructure. So both when we're thinking about what alternative do we use here in the UK and what will European countries do, it's worth kind of considering that maybe you don't even need to really outright ban it if you can kind of somehow think of a way of incentivizing using these other ones a bit, despite whatever state aid rules there are within the European Union. I am not an economist, you can probably tell.
Coming up next, we'll be talking to pen tester, red teamer, and director of Cyberis, Gemma Moore, about how hackers exploit security holes, much like in Twitter's case, and why some of the biggest vulnerabilities may not actually be where you think. That's after the break.
Welcome back. Hacking is perhaps one of the most dramatised and mythologized aspects of technology. You don't have to look hard to find iconography of masked or hoodie-clad criminals in dark rooms hunched malevolently over glowing terminals.
Sadly, as any security professional will tell you, actual hacking is quite a bit more mundane than Hollywood, and indeed much of the security industry, would have you believe. We're joined this week by Gemma Moore, professional penetration tester and director of security consultancy Cyberis, who's going to shed some light on what it's really like to work as a hacker for hire.
Hi, I'm afraid I left my hoodie at home, so no balaclava, no hoodie today.
You're letting the side down.
I know.
So, Gemma, first off, could you tell us a little bit about your background? How did you come to be a professional hacker?
So I finished university and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I did a computing degree and I was interested in networks, I was interested in systems, I did a bit of development, but I didn't think I wanted to do a full-time career in any of those fields. I wanted to do something a bit different, and I was fortunate enough to sort of stumble across a vacancy for a trainee position in penetration testing, and it just sounded fascinating. The idea of sort of finding vulnerabilities in all sorts of different systems, and it really suited me because it was the type of job where you get involved in lots of different things. You get to learn a huge variety of different technologies, different use cases, how you go into different businesses all the time. So you really never have a chance to get bored, and every day is different. And I loved that.
So with that in mind, talk us through breaking into a target. What are the key steps in a successful attack for you?
So it really depends on the motivation. If you're looking at the tactics that, or the motivations of real attackers, most of them are financially motivated. It's quite rare to find a targeted attacker, but the targeted attackers are the ones who are going to do the most damage, so they're the ones that we tend to emulate. There's a few key things that someone who's targeting your data will do. First of all is understanding you, understanding your business, understanding your staff, and that's reconnaissance. So you have to know who you're going to target, and you have to have a good idea about how you're going to target them. And when I say who you're going to target, it normally is people who are targeted. It's via some sort of social engineering or phishing or phone calls or a drive-by download. You tend to be targeting people rather than targeting sort of the network perimeter. There are exceptions to that. So if you've got a website which is taking payments, obviously if you have a financially motivated attacker, if they can compromise that website and put a card scraper on there, that is a very good way of sort of getting a financial return. In terms of actually when you're inside the network, what most adversaries are trying to do is get a foothold on some sort of workstation. That's often via malware that comes in from phishing. It might be even something as simple as persuading someone to run a piece of software. It could be anything, but once you have a foothold inside the network on the workstation, that's when the real work begins. So there was a chap called John Lambert from Microsoft who said once, defenders think in lists and attackers think in graphs, and as long as that is true, attackers win. That is very much how you tend to approach an internal assessment. So when we were talking to defenders, a lot of the companies that we're working with do things like regular vulnerability scanning. And when they're doing their regular vulnerability scanning, they're coming up with a report across their whole estate that's got, a load of high-risk vulnerabilities, medium-risk vulnerabilities, and then some low and informational risk things at the bottom. So they have this list of things to fix. And they tend to be pretty good at patching high-risk vulnerabilities that are shown because servers are missing patches, and they tend to be pretty good at addressing the sort of big red list that comes out of their vulnerability scanner. But what they're not so good at addressing are the issues that we actually end up exploiting. So what's really common when we're doing these types of assessment is we will sit on the network as though we were a normal user, and we'll start looking at the information that normal users can see, and that's things that are in, for example, file shares, home directories. User home directories are an absolute font of information. So everyone is human and everyone behaves in slightly predictable ways. Most of the useful things that we find in file shares. So the larger a network is, the more employees you have, the longer it's been in existence, the more data tends to be lying around where it shouldn't be. If you go into any sort of reasonably sized file share and have a really good rummage around the contents of that file share, assuming it's used for sort of user home directories, you will find things that will help you access systems. So stuff that's common, people often have a document that they keep track of their passwords in their user home directory. Oof. Not a password safe, normally an unencrypted document. Read those, you've got access to all sorts of things. Other things that are common are things like backups being written to, file shares that anyone can read, configuration files for server components, they tend to get written there. And when you're looking for access to a target system, a lot of the time the path isn't directly to that target system. The path or the thoughts of the hacker are along the lines of, right, I have access as Joe Blogs, for example, because I've compromised Joe Blogs through a phishing attack. Let's look at this target system and work out who does have access to this target system. It's probably somebody else. And then you're working out the path between Joe Blogs and this other user account that does have access to that system. And normally, often, that means compromising, for example, the Windows domain. So you'll focus on escalating your privileges until you've got control over the authentication substrate, so the Windows domain, then impersonate the user that does have access to whatever it is that was your objective, the data containing entity, and use their access privileges to gain access. So a lot of the time, if you're doing monitoring of a target system, you might actually forget to monitor for anomalies in the way that your authorized users access those systems, because you're expecting someone to come in and try and brute force a password to access it. You're not necessarily expecting someone to use valid and authorized credentials to access it. So there's a lot of things that defenders can do in terms of understanding the attacker mindset that they don't necessarily do very well in general.
And I mean, obviously, at the moment, we are all working remotely, pretty much, relying on cloud services, that kind of thing. Has this introduced any new security risks? Has it heightened it, or is it just maybe a bit different to how it was when most of us were based in a single office?
I think it depends which company you work for, to be honest. So a lot of companies had already started this kind of transition to a more remote, more zero trusty type infrastructure before the pandemic hit, and their plans have been accelerated, but they were already planning for it. Where you've got additional risk is the companies that have been forced into it without really having designed for it. And in those cases, it's inevitable that, in order to get people to work, they'll have had to compromise on some of their security controls, because obviously it's a business imperative to get people working, whereas the security might be something that can come later. The way people are using platforms like Zoom and Teams and things like this for online meetings, that's exploded, and of course that's another route for people to be socially engineered. If they are, talking with someone face to face in a Zoom meeting, it's the two-way communication thing that generally means that people end up being very very trusted, because humans are nice people generally.
One of the really interesting parts of penetration testing for me is the physical side of things. And we've previously spoken, Gemma, about some of the ways that you can exploit human nature to gain physical access to buildings and to networks. A high-vis vest and a lanyard can go a long way, as you've previously mentioned. We'll link to the feature I wrote with Gemma in the show notes for this episode. But has the transition to remote working cut off some of those potential entryways for physical compromise?
It has and it hasn't. So instead of just having one office, now everyone's home is an office as well. And it all depends on how the trust relationships have been set up. So in some cases, those home workers will effectively be outside the perimeter, VPNing in, so that they logically come inside the perimeter again. In other cases, businesses have got rid of their perimeters entirely, and every single device is protected via sort of zero trust controls and things like that. So in some instances, yes, it will be more difficult now that everything's been decentralized and people are using sort of zero trust remote management for workstations like Intune and things like that. In other cases, what you might find is that you have a bunch of offices that are within a sort of permanently trusted perimeter that nobody's working in, or very few people are working in, and that actually might make it easier to infiltrate because there are fewer people to be suspicious of you.
Yeah, I guess, hello, we are a cleaning crew. We just need to come and dust down the surface.
Or we're doing some extra sanitisation for COVID with this fogger. Let us in. There are all sorts of... There's always a way to persuade people to do something, and you have to understand that that's never going to go away, because ultimately people don't like being rude and they don't like confrontation. And you can't expect people, it's a bit like the shop workers being asked to enforce people wearing masks. You can't expect a shop worker to risk their health and safety getting in a confrontation with someone. You can't expect your employees to do that either.
So Gemma, what are some of the worst security horror stories that you've seen?
Well, funnily enough, we were kind of expecting to see a lot of strange things happening because of lockdown, because of everybody working from home, but we've not really had many stories from our customers on horror stories through lockdown, and that's actually been quite encouraging. But generally there are all sorts of horror stories I could tell you that would keep you up at night. we have customers where, for example, every single user has administrative rights. Ooh. We have customers where they effectively have a standard password that they use across pretty much everything they use. Now, there are a lot of commonalities, and complacency is really a really big problem for information security. Complacency and laziness are the attacker's greatest weapons. Continuous vigilance is kind of what's needed for maintaining information security, because you need to be lucky all the time and your adversary only needs to get lucky once. But it's really difficult to maintain that kind of vigilance. It's impossible. So humans just can't maintain that level of suspicion about everything all the time. It's exhausting. And sometimes the more you know, the more you relax your guard. So when we're doing attack simulations and things like that, we often find that the biggest culprits in terms of leaving things lying around, using bad passwords, that sort of stuff, it's the administrators who are the worst culprits. You know, they're the ones with all the power, but they also get a bit complacent. I think anyone who's ever worked in an IT team understands the phenomenon of there being a sort of shared standard password that everyone kind of knows, that just gets put on new systems, that just gets configured for service accounts, that sort of thing. It happens. It's human nature. And it does, if that password is compromised, and it probably will be because someone will have written it down somewhere, you can't track that back, and you can't work out what the accountability lines are. It's very difficult.
Yeah,
I think that's partly a feature of IT teams, by and large, being slightly understaffed and kind of overworked in a lot of cases. But I also think it comes down to a bit of a tendency within IT people to have this attitude of, oh, I'm not going to be hacked. I'm an IT person. I know how good security works. So obviously, because I know how good security works, if I'm doing it, then it can't be insecure.
Well, yes, and my password is really strong, so no one's going to retrieve it. Well, if it's in memory, unencrypted on a server, and someone's compromised that server, they'll get your super strong password, and they will use it. It's things like that. There's a whole. I could talk for days and days about issues that you have, but technical debt is a real problem. So the longer a network's been around, the more likely it is that there's a sort of built-up technical debt where the drivers for the business have been to get things up and running as quickly as possible, and therefore lots of stuff's been put on as sort of add-ins to new systems, bolt-ons to processes that don't work particularly well, that don't quite do what they need to do. And going back and redeveloping something properly, securely from scratch is too expensive. And over time that builds up into, having to spend an awful lot of time managing BAU processes. And every time you do that, there's probably a security compromise. And every single little security compromise is probably a small security compromise. But over time it builds up. And you end up with sort of shadow IT estate that nobody really knows about, legacy applications that no one can really maintain or patch or monitor even. So over time, it gets more and more difficult for the defenders.
So with all this in mind, what are some of the kind of basic steps that businesses neglect to do and should start kind of proactively addressing in terms of patching some of these entry points that hackers make use of that aren't necessarily flagged as priorities by the business?
So if you have a set of vulnerability scan results, I would have a look at the lows and the infos in your vulnerability scan results and have a good look through network shares. do some good auditing of the permissions of network shares and make sure you're granting the least privileges possible to those pieces of information. It's all very well saying we can educate staff not to fall for phishing attacks, or we can expect people to, confront people that are walking into a building unauthorized, but it's not really realistic. If an attacker is determined enough, they'll find a way to manipulate your staff into doing something. It would be really naive for me to say you could educate your staff to not fall victim to phishing, because ultimately if the phishing premise is good enough, even I will fall victim to a phishing attack. It's as simple as that. So you have to sort of layer your controls, work out where the data is, make sure you're ring fencing it properly, and make sure you're living by the principle of least privilege, so that if one of your users is compromised, what they have access to is the least information and the least data to do their job effectively.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you once again, Gemma, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website www.itpro.co.uk, where you can also sign up to receive our daily newsletter and weekly business briefing bulletin, which brings you all of the best content from ITPro, The Week and Money Week.
You can also follow us on Twitter, where we are at ITPro, as well as Facebook and LinkedIn. Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you find podcasts to never miss an episode. And if you can, leave us a rating and a review. And we'll be back next week with more news and analysis from the world of IT. Until then, goodbye.
Bye. The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.